Julie, I'd like to thank you so much for being part of the Beyond Lab series of Huntington's Victoria. I've had the pleasure of working with you for years, and it's so lovely to have this opportunity to talk to you about the Huntington's Disease Australian Network and the MAP registry project that you've been so passionate about. I know many people in the community already know you. You've been such a fantastic participant of our community conference every year and other activities. But for those that might not have had the opportunity to meet you, could you possibly just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your background and your connection and passion for the Huntington's disease community?
Tammy, thanks so much for inviting me to have a chat with you about this, because you're right, I am very passionate about this topic and I love to talk about it. Whether I'm on an airplane, in a grocery line, whatever, you'll find me talking about Huntington's disease. So I actually got involved in Huntington's disease the year the gene was identified in 1993. And it just happened that that was the year, but I was still training at that time in the United States. And I started having the opportunity to see some patients with Huntington's disease, didn't know what it was. And from, I would say, day one, when I met my first families with Huntington's disease, I was hooked. And I would say I link it back to how compelled I was by the family stories. And that's really the personal side of it, of what drew me in. I mean, we've all got a family. We all know how complex they are. And then, when you toss in Huntington's disease and the multiple generations, it just, there's nothing like it in terms of, the way people are affected and how important it is that we do what we can to kind of ease the burden of the families and the people who are, experiencing Huntington's disease themselves. Then it turned out it was totally interesting time scientifically for Huntington's disease, and it continues to be very interesting. So I suppose, in that way, Huntington's disease, it has so much to offer for a person in my type of career. I'm an academic. I work in research and teaching, and I've conducted research now in Huntington's disease since 1993. My specialty is the changes in thinking and memory and cognition in general that people have. But because I've been around in the field for such a long time, I've been able to be a part of these big natural history studies where we're trying to understand, what are the different symptoms that people with Huntington's disease, what are the different ones that they have? How do they track across time, and how do they lead to the problems in day-to-day living that people have? And so, there have been the big studies like Predict HD and Track HD, and now there's been Enroll HD for more than 10 years. And I've been involved in all of those as a scientist, and really have benefited from just the international community of researchers working together, which I've also loved. And it's been fantastic because the community, as you would know, Tammy, the HD community members, people who are affected by HD, work side by side with scientists to try and do the work. And that is just fantastic. It's unique and really been a fantastic experience. So that's why I'm here, and that's what I do.
And we're very grateful that you do, and that you've been here and have that wealth of experience. And a question that I'd really love to ask you is, which I do ask most researchers who have been in the space for as long as you have you seen the progression of research moving in the right direction, given that you began when the gene was discovered to where we're at now? And I'd love to hear your commentary on where you think we're at the moment.
HD is probably the most well characterized of any neurodegenerative disease. And you could say, why is that? Alzheimer's disease is so much more common. But in Alzheimer's disease, you don't know who's going to get it. And so you only can really start monitoring it when people start showing, more signs and symptoms. Whereas in HD, we can go all the way back to really the point of birth and track it across time. So that has given the field a huge advantage. We've made a huge amount of progress. We can reduce the levels of Huntington protein that are in the body. And, now we have to kind of figure out what other things we need to do to get those changes to translate into the benefits in everyday life.
I think what you've beautifully demonstrated, and thank you, is that because Huntington's is a brain disease, our brains are very complex. And I know you experienced it when we had 2 large international clinical trials that were ceased. that there was a great deal of disappointment across the world for the Huntington's community. And what I think I've learnt from that process is how much we learnt from those clinical trials, and what's come from that, and the complexity, as you say, and not necessarily just focusing on one aspect of the brain, which is the protein, but there are other aspects that also impact. And that's what's so exciting now about the clinical trials, because they're all experimenting and having some real fantastic outcomes in areas that we didn't expect, which is what you alluded to before. So it is an exciting, I feel as though, Julie, for the first time in 17 years, it's a really exciting space.
It is. Well, actually, look, I would say it's been exciting for a long time, but sometimes it hasn't turned out to be as promising as we thought. Now, what we're starting to see is a lot of promising approaches. And one of the things that I feel really optimistic about is, like for a long time, we were really focused on the holy grail of like reduce the Huntington protein. Now we actually know we got to do a lot more things. And so there's a lot of different types of targets, like biological targets that are being, people are trying to create drugs to those targets. And we don't really know, what combination or which ones are going to be the most important, but there's just so many things that are being tried. They all make sense. We just actually don't know what the answer is going to be in the end. So the more different approaches we can try, I think the better, because it just hedges our bets that we're going to find the ones. It's probably going to be more than one. We're going to end up having to have more than one treatment for HD. And the way the field's going, I think it's more productive because more different things are being tried. Yeah,
I agree. And I think you've clearly demonstrated the take-home messages are for people that are at risk and gene positive. There are things that you can do here and now and implement in your life to be proactive around your own health and well-being. And that in terms of the clinical trial space, there's been some fantastic learnings about the complexity of the brain and how, in order to look at effective treatments, we need to be looking at those complexities and not just treating one aspect, but treating multiple aspects. Julie, when you started and I started, that was not information we could share with people.
Yeah,
so
didn't know that.
That's a huge step forward. And that leads me into the question around the Australian Huntington's Disease Network and why you've been so passionate and why you wanted to create that network, the purpose of that.
In Australia, the field hasn't really been as organized as it could be. And I came from the U.S., we had the Huntington Study Group. We knew all these sites, and there's Europe. I've been very involved there as well. And, there are these networks of clinical clinicians, both doctors and then also researchers, all working together. They all know each other. And they kind of, and they're aligned with HD, the HD community, both through organizations like yours, Huntington's Victoria, but also, just broader alignment. Whereas, you come to Australia and we're a really big country. We're really spread out. That's all true. But there wasn't enough synergy, in my opinion. And why do we need that? Well, I'll tell you, it's really important. And why it's so important is if we got a drug approved today, we need to know how can we get that drug out to every single person in Australia who needs that drug. And where we are today, we're not there yet. So if a drug approved today, and I'll tell you, it just sickens me to think that if something comes along, we're not ready to get it to somebody, because everyone who's affected needs to be able to get the drug, and it needs to be indiscriminately available, right? So how are we going to get to that point? Well, that's why I think we need the Huntington's Disease Network of Australia, and that's why our network needs to work with you guys, with Huntington's Australia. We all have to work together, and we need to keep creating the connections that allow us to get drugs approved, get them on the PBS, and get them out to people. So, the Huntington's Disease Network of Australia is really formed to try and look at what are the obstacles that we need to address, what do we need to overcome. And the MapHD registry, which I know we're going to talk about today, is one of those approaches to try and overcome those obstacles. But there's a number of different pieces. I'm getting a really good picture of where people are across this country who have HD. How are they connected to doctors in their area? Because how are we going to get the drugs to them? Well, we got to get the drugs to the doctors that take care of them. So we need to know where those doctors are. So these are the kind of things that we're trying to map out. And the MAP-HD registry is a piece of that. The prevalence study is a piece of that. Another really important piece is another piece that we're doing along with the prevalence study, which is looking at the cost of illness and the burden of disease. Now, these are kind of, when we talk about that, we're not talking about the psychological or the family burdens. We're talking about how much diseases cost. Why do we need to do that? Because we want the Australian government to see the benefit of treating people with HD and reducing those costs, because that's how they decide what to put in the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. So if we want everybody to get drugs, we got to make them so that they're not prohibitively expensive. To do that, we've got to understand the cost of illness and convince the Australian government that they should pay for this, because it's going to pay, it's going to pay them back.
I think another piece of important work that you've been able to do through the network that I've noticed is we have a clinical trial in Australia and New Zealand for the first time. It's actually commenced here through Skyhawk. And what I've noticed is the work that you and your team have been able to do is we actually have predominantly the clinical trial sites have been here in Melbourne and in Sydney. Which has been unfair to other members of the community that live across the country. And I know you and I share that, and it's been a bit of a passion for both of us. And what I've been really pleased to see is there's clinical sites in Adelaide, in Tasmania now. And it's just so fantastic to see around the country that community members don't have to fly into Sydney or Melbourne to be
or have it be inaccessible to them.
Which then also, leads to your point around, discovering where people are located. So when there is a targeted drug for Huntington's, they can access it where they live. So I just wanted to point out, I think that's another piece of really important work that you and your team have been able to achieve. So thank you.
Yeah. I think the Huntington's Disease Network of Australia has formed a clinical trial network, and it goes actually across Australia and New Zealand. Because one of the things to say about the participant, why participating in clinical trials is important for Australia or New Zealand or whoever, is when we were talking a minute ago about how do we get drugs to people. Well, if we actually have a clinical trial, then that means we've established that there are doctors that can do the work. The patients are known to those doctors, and the doctors are known to those patients. Those are the key ingredients for getting drugs to people, right? So the clinical trials and the clinical trial network it's like creating this web of connections between the doctors and the patients that mean that we now know where people are, and when drugs become available, those drugs will probably get most quickly to the doctors that are in the clinical trial network because they're already connected, right? And then they can get to those patients.
Which leads me into the questions around the MAP HD registry, which I'm really excited for you to talk about, Julie, because I know when you commenced it and where you're where you're at with it at this point in time, and I think it'd be really interesting for people to hear from you. What was the purpose of it?
Yeah, for sure. Well, the purpose of the MAP-HD registry was really to give us a chance to hear from as many people as possible about what it's like to try and get services for care, for like doctor care for their Huntington's disease. How many, looking across Australia, how does it look in terms of the accessibility of the neurologists, GPs who know about HD, the different psychologists, speech therapists, physios, etc. So we really wanted to understand, how far do people have to travel? How long did they have to wait for services? And how satisfied are they with the services that they're getting? Okay. And you can't do that by, looking at some existing databases or something like that. You've actually got to go to people and ask them. But we had no way to reach out and ask them. So that's why we formed the MAP-HD registry. Well, we have 380 participants in the registry. And of those, about 200, close to 300 are people who are either pre-manifest or diagnosed with HD. That means there's still like 1,700 out there that we haven't. And we don't know how many. See, that's the thing. We don't know how many there are, but we know there's a lot more that we haven't tapped into. And so the only way people can get to the point where they get into the registry is we have to be able to reach them to say, hey, we've got this registry. Why don't you jump on board, go on the internet and participate.
And for people watching this interview, there will be a link. So please don't be concerned if you're interested after. Please feel free to click on the link and read about not only the Australian network, but also the MAP HD registry. We are a big country, and our medical services are very city centric. And so, with this data, and you might not be able to answer this yet, do you have any plans around how it can potentially impact for the benefit of the community, the delivery of health services to the community?
Yeah, one of the big things, researchers like me do is we're trying to collect the evidence that helps us as a collective, like your group, and more broadly, to go to government and say, these are the problems with what we're doing now. Here is a potential solution. Here's where that solution is needed, and here's what kind of difference it's going to make. Now, that's why it's really important for us to collaborate. Like, for example, now we're doing this work where we've drawn down all these data sets from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare to try and understand what services people are getting, people who have HD. And we're just getting ready to do the data linkage for that, which is a really important piece of, it'll give us a picture for the first time that lets us see, kind of how, like, what the cost to the government is basically of taking care of people who have Huntington's disease. Once we know that, we can go to them and say, have we got a deal for you? If you, put more services in this area, then it's going to reduce, maybe it's going to keep things more at the GP level rather than a hospitalization, or people won't have to be transported 2,000 kilometers to get to services or whatever. So what we need to do is learn as much as we can about what services are being accessed and how much they cost, because then, like, for example, we can sit down together, your team and my team, and the Huntington's Australia team as well. We can sit down together and say, if we, can you tell us how many people have this unmet need? And then you can use that when you go and make a case to government to say, we need more funds to do this, or we need government to support this type of service in this area, and that sort of thing. So
yeah, and I'd like to say thank you not only on behalf of Huntington's Victoria, but the Huntington's disease community, not only in Australia but New Zealand, because I know you work very closely with our colleagues in New Zealand and the community based in New Zealand, for directing your passion in this way and creating the network, and for the first time collecting this really essential data that the associations don't have the resources or the professional expertise to do, which will, as you've demonstrated, will be only of benefit to the community for accessing supports that are informed and educated and localised, which is so important, particularly in this country at the moment where there's such changes in health. And as you've already demonstrated, it's delivered very differently depending on where you live, which should not be the case. You should be able to live anywhere in this country and receive the same access of support, and that's not the case. So I would humbly encourage you to please continue with your wonderful team, and please pass on our thanks to your wonderful team who have also had the pleasure, as you've stated, interviewing and meeting. And if there's anything we can do to support what you do, please don't hesitate to reach out. And of course, we would absolutely love to work collaboratively with you on an ongoing basis. And so thank you, really, is what I wanted to say.
Yeah. And thank you for the work you guys are doing as well. It's so important. And I think, it's really key for organizations like yours to work with researchers and scientists across Australia. I have to say, in terms of science, although we have some really good scientists, there hasn't been a huge amount of science leadership about Huntington's disease in this country. And we've really had to benefit from the stuff that's going on internationally. But we need a strong ecosystem here of the community organizations and the scientists to be able to do the work we need to do as effectively as possible. And that's why we're talking today, and why we've known each other for so many years. But it's not enough.
Julie, can I just say what an absolute pleasure it has been to speak with you. I know we're both in Melbourne, but we don't see enough of each other. And
I agree.
I've been a little bit greedy with this interview, so I apologise in keeping you so long, but I've been so interested in what you have to say. And thank you so much, because I know that you're very time poor and you've been very generous with your time today. So thank you, Julie.
Thanks. You're very welcome.